Rashi says, Lo tignov, thou shalt not steal. Scripture here is speaking about a case of one who steals human beings. It's an instance, Rabbi, where there is almost total unanimity, and it comes from the oral law, but it impacts our understanding of something as basic as not stealing. I would say, given the situation that we're in today with our hostages, you might make a case that this gives us almost a little insight into the sensitivity that we as Jews have to stealing another soul, to kidnapping. I don't know, but here it is in the Ten Commandments, kidnapping is featured. Welcome to Madlik. My name is Geoffrey Stern, and at Madlik we light a spark or shed some light on a Jewish text or tradition. Along with Rabbi Adam Mintz, we host Madlik Disruptive Torah on your favorite podcast platform and now on YouTube. We also publish a source sheet on Sefaria, and a link is included in the show notes. This week's Torah portion is Parshat Yitro. The Ten Commandments are fairly straightforward until we get to the prohibition against stealing. Turns out that the rabbis believe that you shall not steal refers to kidnapping rather than theft. We explore the rabbis' deep interest and insight into stealing. So join us for the art of the steal. So, Rabbi, we're just going to talk about stealing, but as a Bachor Yeshiva, as a Yeshiva student, there were times where you would make noise in the dorm and they would say, quiet, you might be waking somebody up. You might be doing gezel shena, stealing sleep. There are people from the yeshiva who wonder when you go into a store, are you allowed to just check pricing with no intention of buying something? Are you allowed to open up a hardware store next to another hardware store? All of these moral, ethical questions that come up in the yeshiva, not only in the dry texts of the Talmud, but in real life situations, come out of the rabbi's very robust understanding of stealing, what it is to steal, what it is to deceive somebody, gezel da'at, stealing one's thought. It is a fascinating subject, and I've always wanted to kind of dive into it. And so here we are. We're in the Ten Commandments, but we're going to focus on just one.
Amazing. That's really an interesting way to go at it. And you're right. Every yeshiva bacher knows about gezel shena and genevas das. So here we're going to see the way they talk about it. Good. I'm looking forward.
So we're going public. We're giving our listeners an insight into the yeshiva mind, the insight into the Talmudic mind. So we are in Exodus 20:13, right smack in the middle of the famous Ten Commandments. And it says, you shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife or male or female servant or ox or ass or anything that is your neighbor's. So there are a lot of, as the King James Bible would say, thou shalt not here. And right in the middle is thou shalt not steal, that I would reckon to argue, most people would say is one of the most straightforward commandments. We get to Rashi, and Rashi says, Lo tignov, thou shalt not steal. Scripture here is speaking about a case of one who steals human beings, whilst the command in Leviticus, you shall not steal, speaks about a case of one who steals money from another person's property. And he gets into the reason behind his thought. He didn't make this up. It comes from the Mechilta and the Talmud in Sanhedrin. And what they do is you have to look at a verse in context. And since all of the other verses that I just mentioned are culpable with the death sentence, therefore, according to this interpretation, it would make no sense to include a civil offense of simply stealing. So each speaks of a matter which one becomes liable to death by sentence of the court. So thou shalt not steal must be speaking about kidnapping. Again, it's an instance, Rabbi, where there is almost total unanimity. And it comes from the oral law, but it impacts our understanding of something as basic as not stealing. I would say, given the situation that we're in today with our hostages, you might make a case that this gives us almost a little insight into the sensitivity that we as Jews have to stealing another soul, to kidnapping. I don't know, but here it is in the Ten Commandments, kidnapping is featured.
Yeah, that's for sure. I have a following question. So, of course, you're right. It has to be kidnapping because stealing doesn't rise to the level of the Ten Commandments. But I have a question to ask you. That's rabbinic. Do you think that originally in the Ten Commandments, when all they had was the Torah, you think that it meant stealing as a monetary crime? Or you think even from its inception, it had to mean kidnapping?
So I think that what drove the rabbis was something that is not altogether logical. The rabbis believed that if you have a verse, it comes to teach us something. The rabbis believe that there's no repetition. You don't just drop a line twice in the text. Each time has to mean something different. And that was driving them. And I don't think that would be the normal listener's point of view. I also think that there's a relationship between stealing, kidnapping, and stealing things that are monetary. We're going to see the whole gamut. But no, my gut reaction is, and maybe as we progress, we can kind of have this question in mind, but my gut reaction is that it wouldn't be. It wouldn't be related. The only thing that I would say that might relate it is, let's remember not the context of the punishment, but the context of the Exodus. In terms of, I think that you could make a case that many things could be brought into the narrative of slavery and redemption, of servitude and freedom. But I think my gut reaction is that it says don't steal. I would take it as don't steal.
That's it. Okay. I think that's probably right. And I think that's an interesting point, right? So the rabbis kind of, evolve the explanation, but that's not what it means in the simple text.
And so I think, as I said in the intro, this is more a discussion and a commentary on the rabbinic mind than it necessarily is on the intention of the biblical text. But in terms of the rabbinic mind, it is something in line with what we discussed last week that kind of becomes ingrained in us, the Jewish people, the readers of these texts, and how they were perceived. And my guess is that although for us we need a Rashi to remind us that it's kidnapping, maybe through the generations impacted by what the rabbi's interpretation was, that's how they took it. We'll see. We'll see as we progress. Rashi references Leviticus 19:11, where there is another reference to stealing. It says, "You shall not steal, you shall not deal deceitfully or falsely with one another, you shall not swear falsely by my name, profaning the name of your God, you shall not defraud your fellow, you shall not commit robbery, the wages of a laborer shall not remain with you until morning." So on the one hand, what this verse was saying to Rashi is, this in the Ten Commandments does not have to talk about robbery or stealing as we know it. There's another verse who deals with that. But on another perspective, Rabbi, what Leviticus starts to show to us is how broad the Jewish, the Israelite, the rabbinic mind took stealing. All of a sudden, we're talking about wages of a laborer shall not remain to you until morning. I'd like to say I'm sitting here looking outside in Connecticut at a lot of snow on the ground. And there's this beautiful saying that says the Eskimos have 50 words for snow. I think what we might come up with today is that the Jewish mind, the rabbinic mind, had 50 ways for stealing. In other words, they were very sensitive to deceit. They were very sensitive to taking somebody a property away from them, taking somebody's identity away from them. That's what my read is. And getting back to your original question, what I'd like to argue is there's a whole spectrum of meaning that the rabbis saw and maybe the reader saw in the word stealing. And that might be true to the text.
Yeah, I think that's good. And you see that from the verse that there are so many different areas that are all under the category of stealing.
Yeah. So let's get back to what the rabbis say the Ten Commandments is talking about. In Sanhedrin, the Gemara asks, from where is a prohibition against abducting a person derived? Rabbi Yoshia says that is derived from the verse, you shall not steal. That's our verse. Rabbi Yochanan says that it is derived from the verse, they shall not be sold as slaves. In Leviticus, the Gemara comments, and they do not disagree, these two rabbis, as each requires both verses to derive the prohibition. One says Rabbi Yoshia enumerates the prohibition against abduction, and one sage, Rabbi Yochanan, enumerates the prohibition against selling the abductee into slavery. This is what I was talking about before. The rabbis saw a connection between the do not steal in the Ten Commandments and this being a slave and being sold as a slave, and do not sell someone as a slave because you were a slave in Egypt. And so maybe, yes, that did color the way they saw that do not steal in the Ten Commandments. And maybe for 600,000 slaves listening to this, when they heard about stealing, they didn't know so much about mercantile stealing and possessions. They did know a little bit about stealing people.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that's right. You say, what's the history of kidnapping? And I think we know from the Bible itself that kidnapping is something that goes back to the ancient world.
A very, very ancient world. It was, we will see that it was part and parcel of culture. But again, it does take us back to that original sin that we discussed in a previous episode of Joseph being captured and then Joseph being sold into slavery.
That's not, by the way, that's not exactly the same thing as kidnapping.
Okay.
Right. I mean, that I was going to say the war of the 4 kings against the 5 kings. They took Lot as a hostage. Right. I mean, it's interesting to see, how those cases relate to our cases. But clearly in the Bible, there are cases of kidnapping.
Yes. Yes. And I think that hostage taking, kidnapping, bounty hunting, when you're waging a war, taking possession of people under who you conquer, they're all kind of connected, but they're all unfortunately differently. We have a very nuanced language of taking somebody else. So the Ibn Ezra becomes kind of fascinating exactly for what you just brought up. He says on our verse, stealing implies taking money secretly. There are thieves who incur the death penalty, namely those who kidnap an Israelite, be he a child or one who cannot speak clearly. And I scratched my head, Rabbi, when I read this. And I said, what is he talking about? Ben shehu nar katan o nelag lashon. And it made me realize that there's another part of kidnapping that was probably very well known, but we don't talk about or think about much. My father, his mother took many years to have a baby. And when she finally had the baby, she read in the newspaper that 2 children were misplaced in the hospital, that the mother took home the wrong child. So she had him at home. There are stories about the Yemenites who came to Israel that maybe the labor government took their babies in a way to acculturate them and gave them to Ashkenazi or other families. There was a documentary on TV about an adoption agency that somehow was placing children in different homes. That's a whole other part of kidnapping that we don't talk about, but it's pretty clear that when the Ibn Ezra says, be he or a child or one who cannot speak clearly, means the child doesn't know who his parents are. Or if he knows who his parents are, he can't articulate who his parents are. He's brought up in another environment. So again, that was kind of fascinating to me.
Did you check the etymology of the word kidnapping?
I looked it up. There was no Wikipedia page. I saw like a Merriam-Webster type of thing,
Right.
and it was related to the kid. It
Oh, it
was
is.
related.
I never, in all the years, I never thought about that. But of course, it's right. That's who you kidnap, is you kidnap children. That's interesting. That's
Either
great.
because you're barren or whatever the reason was.
It must be that that's who they kidnapped in the world when that word was created.
It was a thing. It was a thing.
It was a thing.
So we get to the Mishnah Torah by Maimonides, who codified the law. And he says the Torah prohibits stealing even the slightest amount. It is forbidden to steal as a jest, as a joke, to steal with the intent to return. In the Hebrew, it says almanat lahachzir. Some of the commentaries we're going to see in a second have a fascinating textual emendation to this, because why would one ever want to steal in order to return? He goes on to say, or to steal with the intent to pay. All is forbidden, lest one habituate oneself to such conduct. So again, from the mindset of Maimonides, there's more to stealing than taking the object from another person. There's a mindset that should not become habitualized. And then, of course, he goes into the difference between, and this the Ibn Ezra focused on for a second, the difference between a thief and a robber. A thief takes unbeknownst to the owner, not in front of the owner, and a robber confronts the owner as well. But there's no main difference for what we're concerned. Here's where it gets interesting, Rabbi. In Baba Metzia, the Talmudic source for Maimonides, the Gemara says, why do I need the prohibition, you shall not steal, that the merciful one wrote? This is not another prohibition against taking money by illegitimate means, and it could be derived from other provisions mentioned previously. The Gemara answers that it is necessary for the merciful one to write that prohibition for that which is taught in a Breita. You shall not steal applies in all circumstances. Even if you did so in order to aggravate the victim, you shall not steal applies in all circumstances. Even if you did so in order to pay the double payment as a gift to the person with whom you stole. And this is why they changed Maimonides. In other words, Rabbi, they thought of a scheme for someone who wanted to help his fellow friend. And so what he does is he steals $100 knowing that the law is, depending on the circumstances, you have to pay back either double
$200 or 4 or 5 times.
4 or 5 times. What are people we belong to that people would come up with a money laundering scheme such as this in order to benefit the recipient? You know, at my grandfather's funeral, somebody told me they heard a story that he was in a resort area called Bournemouth in England. And they used to go there for the high holidays. And somebody comes over to my grandfather and says, I had a tough year. Could you help me out with high holidays tickets? And my grandfather very gruffly said no, which wasn't characteristic of him. And the man walked away, and the person who told me this story said then my grandfather went to the sexton and say, buy him tickets and put it on my account. And he said to him, why did you do it that way? So my grandfather said, I don't want him looking at me the whole high holidays as if I paid for his tickets. I mean, it was so, I think, representative of my grandfather, who kind of like really enjoyed doing a mitzvah, maybe with a little bit of an angle, but it also tapped into the Jewish neshama, the Jewish soul. And here we have a scheme. We've uncovered a scheme for being able to give to a per person money and making it seem like it's obligation, not like you're supporting him.
Fantastic.
So again, I think the real interesting takeaway, besides how people might steal in order to help somebody, is twofold. On the one hand, Maimonides says, don't get into the habit of stealing. No matter what the reason, it's a bad mindset. And the other thing is, and we're going to come across this, I believe, going forward, is this whole end sense of the ends justify the means. That sometimes you can cut a few corners, but as long as you're doing it for the right intentions, as they say, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. You can't do it. And that's a fascinating study in what Geneva or stealing meant in the rabbinic mind.
Yeah, well, the ends justify the means in a legal sense is fascinating. Okay, let's see what the Ramban says.
So the Ramban, as always, is, he's going to quote Rashi, and he is going to also quote the Ibn Ezra. And what he says is fascinating. He says that actually, and he literally puts it into the context of all of the 10 Commandments. And he says, what God is saying, now I have commanded you to acknowledge in thought and in deed that I am the creator of all, and to honor parents because they joined me in your formation. So now he's basically going from commandment 1 to 5, Rabbi, and saying the first thing is, if you honor God, you have to honor the parents who are a partner in creating each of us. Then it says, if so, guard against destroying the work of my hands and spilling the blood of man. Don't kill, who I have created in order to honor me, and acknowledge me in all of these manners. And do not commit adultery with your fellow man's wife, because you will thereby destroy the principle of honoring parents, causing the children to deny the truth and acknowledge falsehood. They will not know their fathers, and thus give their honor to another, just as idol worshippers do, who say of a block of wood, thou art my father. So he's tied in stealing, he's tied in adultery, all to the first 5 commandments of honoring one's father in heaven and one's parents. He warned against stealing a human being. So Ramban follows the traditional interpretation, for that too brings about a similar disintegration of values. With respect to their stringency and penalties, the order of the commandments is as follows. After idolatry comes bloodshed, and after that adultery, and then stealing of a human being, and false testimony, and robbery. So now the commentary found something interesting. Ramban believes that coveting also relates to the action of robbery. Ramban mentioned here robbery, although the 10 Commandments speak of coveting. Why? Because he who does not covet will never harm his neighbor. Thus, he completed all obligations that a person owes towards his neighbor. So Ramban is able to get into the 10 Commandments, both kidnapping and stealing.
Well, let's talk for a minute about what that means. Lo tachmod, you shall not covet. And it says robbery. He's worried about a legal problem, Geoffrey. And that is, I covet, you drive down the street and you're driving in your convertible sports car. And I covet that sports car. There's no way that there's a prohibition in that. There's no way. The prohibition is that if I covet your sports car convertible and that leads me to steal it, then I'm in violation of 2 things. Thou shalt not covet, and thou shalt not steal.
So what you're saying is, and it's so strongly ingrained in biblical and rabbinic thinking, that thoughts cannot be forbidden, just even as belief in the 10 Commandments. There's a big argument whether believing in God is one of our commandments. We believe in orthopraxis, Rabbi Riskin used to say, not orthodoxa. We believe in correct practice and not correct belief. But here, certainly, what Ramban seems to be implying is that if you're not allowed to covet, it must mean you're not allowed to do an action that comes out of coveting. Now, Cassuto disagrees with Ramban, but in his disagreement, he brings some verses that say, and if you believe like Ramban, you would bring these verses. So he brings a verse from Exodus. And it talks about when you go on the pilgrimage holiday, it says, I will drive out nations from your path and enlarge your territory, so no one will covet your land when you go to appear before your God 3 times a year. So there it uses the same word, lo yachmod ish et artso, where clearly it means, why would you go up to Jerusalem 3 times a year and leave your property by itself? It's like everybody in Israel has Broadway tickets. They're all going to be robbed. So here you can argue there is that connection between actually the word between it. And so similarly, there's a word in Micha. But what I love is that Ramban is trying to create a narrative out of the 10 Commandments, and he's trying to fit both kidnapping and the more pedestrian stealing into that narrative. I'm not sure it's there, but I give him an A for effort. And again, he's trying to put it into context, but what he's putting into context is this idea of the social network. And that's what Ramban is really saying, that if you do any one of the thou shalt nots in the second tablet, you are breaking the social network that is formed by saying, God, everyone is created in God's image, and your parents are partners in that. And then anything you do to disrupt that is breaking the social image, the social network. And in a sense, stealing comes up twice in that. And that's kind of fascinating.
Good. I would agree with that. I mean, that just shows you how serious stealing is, but it moves from kidnapping back to stealing, right? The minute that you talk about coveting and stealing, that's not kidnapping, that's stealing.
Yeah. Again, and it elicits this whole conversation, but we are involved with stealing. So there is a midrash in Pirkei de Rav Eliezer that, Rabbi, I know you like a lot because you've mentioned it a few times. And what it says, according to Rabbi Tarfon, the Holy One, blessed be He, rose and came from Mount Sinai and was revealed unto the sons of Esau. So there are a bunch of midrashim that says, why did the Jews get the Torah? Did God go ahead and offer the Torah to the other nations of the world? So in this rendering of that midrash, it says that he revealed it unto the sons of Esau, as it is said, and it quotes Deuteronomy, and the Holy One, blessed be He, said to them, will you accept for yourselves the Torah? They said to him, what's written in the Torah? And he answered, it's written, you shall not murder. They replied to him, we are unable to abandon the blessing which Isaac, Esau, and said, by the sword shall you live. Fine. Then he goes on to the sons of Ishmael, and he says, will you accept the Torah? And they said, what's written therein? He answered, thou shalt not steal. Our verse. And he said, they said to him, we are not able to abandon the usage which our fathers observed, for they brought Joseph down into Egypt, as it is said, for indeed I was stolen away of the land of the Hebrews. So what's interesting about this midrash, Rabbi, is that number one, even in this midrash, they consider thou shalt not steal kidnapping. Right. Because they reference the story of Joseph. The other thing that's interesting is, again, they bring it back into the narrative of Yetziat Mitzrayim, of leaving Egypt. The third thing that we have to make clean is one issue. When you read so many of the texts of stealing that we talk about, it says Re'ehu, from your brother. And what that is typically translated is many of these laws have a double standard, Jew to Jew and Jew to non-Jew. And in this midrash, the Bnei Yishmael are saying, we can't accept this law, this prohibition against kidnapping other people from other tribes, from other countries. It's clear in the understanding of this midrash here that when the 10 Commandments say thou shalt not steal, it means anybody. And specifically, it means someone who's not your tribal brother. And I think that's fascinating.
That's also interesting, right? That's an amazing expansion of the law.
It is. And I think it's a wonderful lens to read this midrash through, because normally we just read it in terms of the Torah was was offered to other people in the world. But what it gives us is a better insight into what's in the Torah and what it is that we actually accepted. So we are running out of time. As I said in the introduction, there is Sefaria notes in the show notes for this podcast. But there are other usage of the word to steal that the rabbis say, and one of them has to do again with our parsha. And it has to do, and it says that God himself may have been, I would say, guilty of being involved in stealing. There's a part that says, which is worse, to steal or to have someone steal from you and not say anything. And it's talking about something that I mentioned before, genevat dat, when you are deceitful to somebody. So which is worse, the Talmud asks, to be deceitful or to have someone be deceitful and not say anything? And the answer that the rabbinic source gives is it's worse to not say anything. And the example that they give using that wonderful word that you raised last week of kiviyachol, Rabbi, is that when God heard the Jewish people say, Na'aseh v'nishma, we will listen, and then we will observe, he knew they were deceiving him, and he said nothing. It's
amazing. It happens to be that source in your sources is the Tosefta. And it's an amazing Tosefta. Whose crime is greater, the thief or that he who has stolen from? You could say the one who has stolen from him was silent. As we find when Israel was standing at Mount Sinai, they asked to deceive a God, as it is written. Everything that God says we will do and we will obey, as if to say it was stolen to them, as we learned. May they always be of such mind to revere me and follow my commandments. And if you argue that not everything is revealed before him, we have already said you have deceived him with their speech.
So it is truly amazing that when you're talking to somebody and you know they need help and they say something and you accept it, even though that you know they're trying to deceive you, you are as bad as the deceptor himself. We have in other episodes talked about the wonderful mitzvah of source citing. When Esther cited her source, it says, Ha'omer davar b'shem omro. But the other side of that, Rabbi, is the rabbinic text saying that you have to cite your source, and that if you steal somebody else's material, you are culpable of stealing. We've talked about shopping laws. We've talked about opening up stores next to another store where you're stealing a livelihood. It really, truly is amazing how far the rabbinic mind and I would say, our combined mind of the Jewish people has taken this concept of deceiving and being deceptive. There are rules about, can you use an etrog that was stolen? Mitzvah habam aveira. If you think at the rules that go through the spectrum of kidnapping all the way to trivial mercantile stealing something, it is truly profound what the rabbis made of it. And I think that at the end of the day is what the gift of our reading of the commandments today in terms of thou shalt not steal is. And it's our own little revelation at the foot of Sinai that will give us pause and make us think a little bit more about how we speak and how we act and how we interact with each other.
Fantastic. What a great topic. Enjoy the Parsha, everybody, and we look forward to seeing you next week.